Thank you for joining me today. My name is Cydney Ross. I am the Outdoor Education Manager for Deep Roots, and I'm also one of the stewards here in the landscape at the Anita B. Gorman Conservation Discovery Center in Kansas City. So if you've been here to the Discovery Center, you may see me working out in the weeds, cutting plants back, designing with intent, or leading naturalist programs. And with Deep Roots, I also lead our educational webinar series, including Lunch and Learn, Native Plants at Noon, as well as in-person events like guided nature hikes, work and learn gardening days, which is great for people who want to learn more about how to garden with natives. So there's a lot of wonderful opportunities to get involved in the native plant community here in Kansas City and beyond. So I'd like to give a special thanks to my organization, Deep Roots, as well as Missouri Department of Conservation. They are the ones who are supporting us with this program today, and they are the ones who bring nature closer to home for everyone here in the state of Missouri. All right, so for today, our program overview is all about DIY native landscape design, but specifically I'll go into the value of observing your space, research and inspiration, visualizing your garden, designing your garden to scale, and a lot of personal anecdotes sprinkled in. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we'd love to have your interaction in the chat. Feel free to put comments or things that you like to do in relation to whatever I'm talking about in that moment. And then if you have questions, please put those in the Q&A, because at the end of this presentation, I'll have a bit of time to answer your questions about your garden. And before I jump into talking about native landscape design, but also showing you some of the gardens I've designed and how they have worked out over the past couple years, I also want to go over just a few definitions, because light definitions, am I right? Like, what's part shade versus part sun? Well, for me, the easiest way to think about it is part shade is morning sun and shaded out by afternoon. So when the sun first comes up, it's not as intense. So it has a different impact on plants compared to part sun, which is when your plants are mostly shaded in the morning, but from afternoon on, they are exposed to that hotter, most likely western or south-facing sun. And then for full shade and full sun, may seem self-explanatory, but I like to encourage you all to kind of envision yourselves either in a woodland or in a prairie when you think about those two types of sun requirements. So full shade, 6 hours or more of shade, and same with full sun, 6 hours or more of direct sun. That will help you not only just understand kind of the jargon when you're looking at plants and selecting them, but also when you're observing your space. Oh, also, I want to mention this great app that I use to help me identify new to me species, including plants and wildlife. There's both Seek and iNaturalist by Nat Geo, and they're free apps that are really great to learn about nature in your own backyard, but also your contributions aid community science. So the data that's collected is utilized by conservation research and scientists. So it's kind of a cool thing. I definitely nerd out with it and have, I think, like 400 observations at this point, and more to be had. Okay, so I mentioned right out the gate that taking time to observe your space is crucial. So I want to show you an example of the very first house I bought and how excited I was to start adding native plants. But did I take the time to see what the sunlight and where the water would sit? No, I didn't. I jumped right in. And I want to just use myself and this personal anecdote as a learning tool for you all. So this garden here is right up at the front door of this house along the sidewalk, and to the right is a driveway. And what you can see is the shade coming down from a silver maple. Well, when I first moved in, it was winter time, and in my eyes, it looked like it had lots of sunlight. So I thought, oh, great, I could put prairie species here. Now, notice kind of in that far corner here, you can see some yarrow, and there's some echinacea, purple coneflower in there. That ended up, this strip here ended up being the only section of true full sun or even part sun situation. So initially, I had planted all full sun prairie loving species to find out as spring shifted into summertime, I was dealing with a dry, mostly full shade bed, with the exception of that little strip of intense afternoon sun. So what did I do? I did not waste the plants that I had planted. Instead, once I realized my mistake and noticed the plants were starting to struggle, I moved them. So learn from your experiences, learn from my experiences. But there's things you can do to prevent this scenario from happening. And a lot of that has to do with doing a little bit of research on your end. So again, I can't stress enough, take the time to observe your space. I try to give myself a full year, if it's, my own property, to just learn the nuances, because micro habitats, these areas around our property, for example, will have different needs, like that really hot, dry strip there compared to on the north side of the house where there's lots of moss growing, right? So you can kind of get indications of what might work well in those situations just by taking the time to look around. It's also important to know what your gardening goals are. Gardening goals will ultimately, next to the type of site you have, will inform your plant decisions. So are you wanting to plant flowers for pollinators? Are you hoping to have overwintering habitat for that little solitary nesting bee that came out of that hydrangea stem there? Or are you wanting to attract songbirds and wildlife so that they have plenty of food resources? These are all great things, and getting clear on what those goals are will ultimately help you in your decisions before you start your designs. It's also important to know your invasive species. So let's just do a little definition here. A non-native invasive species is in this case, we're talking about plants. So non-native plant from a different country that has come over here due to human global transportation and is thriving in our climate. So I never villainize our wildlife or flora, because it's truly not the plant's fault. It's actually our fault. So these plants do so well here because if you took the globe and you drew a line across, you'll find that these plants thrive in a very similar climate of ours. So the reason why they do so well here is because they have not the wildlife here has not evolved alongside it. So there aren't any biological pressures to keep these species in check. So they aren't eaten by insects rarely, or mammals or other wildlife, but they do spread really well, right? So I guess an example of honeysuckle and Callery pear, right? The fruit ripens. Oh, even winter creeper. When the fruit ripens, the birds will eat it. And yes, though you're seeing them eat it, it's not high quality nutrition that they have evolved to need. So it actually can make them sick, but they do end up spreading it elsewhere. So a native plant could never be considered an invasive species. I just want to clarify that. Native plants can be prolific and good spreaders. I don't like to use negative terms for that either, because I just think language is such an important and delicate thing. So being aware of what you have and why they're here, that kind of helps inform everything that I do anyway. So, and if you have invasive species in your landscape, like winter creeper or shrub honeysuckle, it's important to have a plan on how to manage or remove it completely. Because in the case of shrub honeysuckle, Lonicera macchii, it has a allelopathic chemical, which means that it inhibits or prohibits the growth of other plants around it. So as those berries fall in the fall, they are kind of like black walnuts, the juglone. It is it's adding that chemical to the ground and preventing other things from growing up around it. So set yourself up for success, because if you try planting underneath or in some of these things, it's not even going to grow in the first place. One other thing I do want to mention is not only knowing like what invasive plants are in your yard, but just paying attention to what is already growing and succeeding in your yard. Again, those are clues to let you know what kind of site you have, what kind of sunlight, how much moisture is there, all that good stuff. So you'll hear right plant, right place. This phrase used to frustrate me to no end because when I first started with native plants, I didn't know which plants would go in the right places, so to speak. And a really great way to think about this, again, is look to Mother Nature. I like to go out into the wild. These are photos I took on the left at Bluebell Valley, here in Kansas City, and then on the right at near Paintbrush Prairie in Cole Camp. When you go out into nature, you already see these natural communities who have been working together for thousands of years. You know, they've evolved together. They have a very intricate and deep relationship. And they're often, if you see them growing naturally, that could be a good clue of what might work well in a similar situation at your home or in your landscape. But also, even though some plants do better in certain situations, I'm not above experimenting and pushing the boundaries. So I think a little calculated risk can be a good thing. And of course, before you start your designs, I want you to get inspired. Come out and visit us at the Anita B. Gorman Conservation Discovery Center. Go to Burr Oak Woods or your local MDC Nature Center or conservation area just to see what looks good. What do you like? For me, being a very visual person, I'm constantly taking photos. And actually, the past 3 winters, I've done a very good job of going back through all my photos to kind of see just to take a look back at what was going on in the landscape in the prior year, because there's so much good stuff out there. I couldn't possibly keep it all in my head. These are just some really beautiful plant combinations that I've so just thinking about that. And if your gardening goals are to have blooms or something of visual interest throughout the year, this is also a great way to look back on your phone. Your phones categorize your images by month or even by geolocation. So you can kind of see, figure out what was in bloom when, so that you can fill in those gaps and make sure you have something of interest throughout the year. And do your research. So this is a pretty like hardcore spreadsheet. And not hardcore, but for me, it's funny. I put this together and it's something I actually don't utilize as much anymore. I rely mostly on my experience and just kind of my internal knowledge. But you could go ahead and gather all the plants you want, that you're thinking about adding into your landscape, and add what their sun requirements are, how tall do they get, how wide, what kind of soil do they like. You could even go as far as to do a color bloom chart, which you can see at the bottom left. Or you can do also what I do on the right and sketch things out. So funny enough, I am definitely more of a visual tactile learner. I can't read a textbook to save my life. So the fact that I have like this spreadsheet with info is kind of interesting. But you know, whatever tools you need to understand native plants, that's what matters at the end of the day. You don't have, there's not any one right way to do it. In fact, I should have prefaced this at the beginning, but this is just the way I go about doing this. So there's many other ways you can approach native landscape design, but this is what I found has worked for me. So the image on the right shows some sketches. I have a concept sketch I did for Primrose Prairie, even my little nature journal. When I was first getting into native plants, I would look up a plant, draw it, and then write some notes. And that was a great way for me to learn. Also, there's great resources online, of course. So through Deep Roots, we have our Sweet 16 Most Likely to Succeed Native Plant List. This was a list put together by local or regional native plant experts, including nurseries, designers, educators, and consultants. And we tried to decide what are, for us, the top 16 plants that have done well in our garden and could be either a launching point for new gardeners, or an opportunity for experienced gardeners to add more biodiversity into their landscape. So at the next week, I will email you all resources, which include links to some of the things that or all the things I'm mentioning today. But this is one I want to bring up. So if you are in a position where you're like, yeah, I want to design my own garden, but I don't know how in depth I want to go, you don't need to recreate the wheel necessarily. Go online to Deep Roots, look at our Sweet 16. Sarah Beyer of Oak and IO put together these wonderful designs that are free on our website so that you can get a sense of how to add these plants to your own landscape without a lot of hassle. So I love this shady soft landings. As many of you know, having a garden right under your tree is one of the best ways to support wildlife in your backyard, because our big mature oaks and things like that are host plants to a lot of our insects, which feed baby birds. So that's just a sidebar. But anyway, there's a lot of good information on our website about different designs. And I want to mention, in your research, I encourage you to go check out these books. I will also list those in the resources for you all. Not only are they helpful, like the two at the bottom left and right by Alan Brandhagen, these show you different species and go into depth about each one. Whereas the Planting in a Post-Wild World, the Living Landscape, and Prairie Up are geared more towards design. And then the top right, I'd be remiss if I did not mention Roy Diblick's The No Maintenance Perennial Garden, because it's one thing to plant a garden, it's another thing to grow a garden. All gardens require maintenance, but really this planting stage can be a crucial opportunity to make sure you're picking plants that require maintenance that you're willing to do, right? Some plants require more help than others, just like you and me, right? We're all a little different. So that's why I can't stress being a planner over a plopper. And I wanted to go ahead and take this little clip from Planting in a Post-Wild World by Thomas Rayner and Claudia West. This, for me, is a quintessential way to get started with native plants in terms of landscape design. I like to break it down into 3 layers, starting with your structural layer, considering existing trees, shrubs, or even really tall herbaceous perennials that have a lot of presence. You may also consider things like infrastructure, like a house, shed, sidewalk, things like that, which will always be constant. And then from there, and another reason to know what your structural layer is going to be is because that will also likely dictate the type of sun or shade situation you've got going on. From there, you hit that middle layer. They're calling it seasonal themed plants, which I do like, because for me, it's not all about the blooms. Don't get me wrong, I love blooms, but I'm also thinking about texture. I'm thinking about shapes. I'm thinking about, what are these plants going to look like in 6 months when they are dried out? Do they have some aesthetic qualities in addition to supporting wildlife over winter? But again, that seasonal theme, also bearing in mind you have something of interest at any given point in your garden. And partly, I think a bit about that is a matter of shifting perspective on what we find beautiful and maybe expanding our language there. Okay, then the third and perhaps one of the most important layers, well, I guess they're all kind of important, aren't they? But the ground cover layer. Think about this as your mulch layer. And you could go ahead and do a layer of mulch, but I would recommend instead you consider ground cover species. And I'm talking the plants that get no taller than 6 inches. We have our golden groundsels. We have our purple poppy mallows. There's all kinds of really great, sedges, right? Little grassy things. Lots of great options. Does is acts as a green mulch, which is great because no matter what, like if you put wood chip mulch, or if you just have bare earth, you're going to have other plants coming in. So you might as well be the one to decide what's going to be there. And also by having these native ground cover species, again, they kind of fill in and really make it more of a community. It helps prevent erosion. It will help keep the moisture in, and it just looks good. And a lot of these ground cover species are semi-evergreen, so they'll stay consistently vibrant even through winter. Okay. So this chart here is something Alex and I made last year. If you are familiar with Planet Native, not this year, but the year prior, we did a presentation on the incredible editable native plant garden. Say that 3 times fast. I went ahead and brought this portion from that presentation because I find it especially useful when I'm faced with many options but need to focus and start small. And that is a big recommendation for all you new gardeners or anyone who's starting a native plant garden is you can go ahead and design the whole thing, but the work involved with actually installing it is a whole other game. So don't be afraid to start small and plant in shifts and waves. And this kind of chart really helps here. So at the top, we have the axes of height. And I, again, use that previous graphic to kind of show ground cover, middle, and then tall structural elements. And on the other side, I have light. So imagine that this is, let's say it's well, I guess I have a drawing that'll show you what this example is, but I went ahead and filled this in with some native species here. And again, this is a way for me to stay contained because as you'll see in some of my later designs, it's very easy for me to do a lot of biodiversity. But for those getting started, that can be really overwhelming. So set yourself up for success. In this case, the structural elements are existing trees in the landscape, plus a shrubby St. John's wort. And not only, oh, I guess in that previous one, that axis was light, but here I have season. So I mentioned the existing structural trees. I mentioned the shrubby St. John's wort, which will also look good summer through fall. And then in the middle ground, in this example, I've got pale purple coneflower, which is a spring bloomer, followed by prairie blazing star in the summer, and finishing out with side oats grama, a beautiful native grass that is really a wonderful addition to most native gardens. That will be that middle ground layer and really stand out in the fall. And then the final short layer in the spring, I've got rose verbena, followed by purple poppy mallow in the summer, and aromatic aster. Now, aromatic aster isn't necessarily a ground cover, I know, but in this case, I think it works well enough. And in this hypothetical scenario, you'll see kind of my intention there. So this, the chart I just showed you is related to what the activity I'm about to explain here. Again, this is one way of designing a garden by doing overlay sketches of your site. So what I recommend is get either 3 printed black and white copies of your space, or you can have one printed copy plus some tracing paper, and then get some color pencils. And for all you out there, I'm pointing to you. If you think, oh, I'm not an artist, I can't do this. If you can grasp a pencil and do some scribbles, you can also do this, I swear. So taking from the species I put in that chart, I've now kind of sketched out what it would look like here in the landscape. So you can see the pale purple coneflowers, the rose verbena on the ground, as well as the existing trees. And then the little scrappy brown thing covering up the electrical box there is the shrubby St. John's wort. So advance into summer. I have the leaves filled out in the trees. The shrubby St. John's wort is blooming. We've got our blazing star, purple poppy mallow, side oats, and rose verbena is one of those that will continuously bloom throughout the year. We've even had it bloom in November before. So just having this progression so you can really visualize not only what it will look like at one moment, but throughout the year, because that's really important, right? Our gardens are dynamic. They're always changing. And this is a really great way to kind of visualize that. And again, you don't have to be an artist to do this. I really just scribbled on here. So since I had the rose verbena and the poppy mallow, I just tucked in some aromatic aster. Now, in this hypothetical garden, I would likely cut the aster after it flowers just to kind of contain the seeds in this hypothetical tiny strip of garden at the Discovery Center. So that's just one way of kind of visualizing your garden, but we're going to jump into some other ways of doing it as well. Oh, and these are what those plants look like. So purple poppy mallow, top left background, right in the foreground, we've got our pale purple coneflower, rose verbena in the bottom left, aromatic aster at the very bottom center, shrubby St. John's wort shrub on the right, bottom right. And above that is the prairie blazing star and side oats grama grass. This is another very similar approach. I was asked to help with the habitat restoration initiative here. They're doing some awesome work at Gillum Park. They've removed a ton of honeysuckle. If you're here in KC, go take a look. I'm really impressed. It's them and the KC Parks ambassadors. So, I got that confused. KC Parks ambassadors did the honeysuckle removal. Habitat restoration initiative is actively planting native plants in the landscape. Ideas for them. So this is also a great tool if you're trying to get like an HOA on board or even your partner, like show them your intention, right? I think that goes a long way in this process. And these are the plants referenced there. Oh, and I will mention, like, technically this sketch isn't completely accurate. Well, one is a sketch, it's not a photo, but most of those plants would not be blooming at the same time, which is why going back to the seasonal sketches can be really helpful in having accurate representation of your space. But this I just volunteered my time for, so. Yeah, those are the plants I had in that hypothetical concept sketch. And again, there are so many ways to go about creating landscape designs. I really want you all to think of them to your garden. It's really just a way for you to organize your information so that you feel confident when you go out to start planting. So these are just lots of different examples of how garden designs look, right? They can be a little square, it could be an initial, it could be a swath of color. It doesn't really matter as long as you are reaching your goals at the end of the day. Okay, so we're going to talk about creating designs to scale, and then I'm going to jump into a few site studies to show you some native plant designs I've created and then installed. So just a quick note on creating designs to scale. I'd recommend when you are out in your landscape deciding where your garden is going to be, you bring with you a measuring wheel or measuring tape. Measuring wheel is my new best friend. I carry one in my car everywhere I go, just in case, because I don't like to bend over and like try to hold a little measuring tape in one spot. Also bring some paper and pen. And again, these initial sketches are going to look like chicken scratch, so don't worry about it. This is all only for you. A few other useful tips. I recommend you take photos of the area in question from different vantage points and at different times of day. That can really inform exactly how much sunlight is hitting there. And that way you're not standing outside the whole time tracking the sun movement. Also, use stationary objects like trees, your house, a shed, sidewalk, etc. for measurement reference points. Also, I find that it's useful to have a hose or a piece of rope to lay out the footprint of a garden, especially if you're doing curves. And I want to preface this, my background is fine arts. I already mentioned that reading textbooks is not my forte, so you can imagine math is also not my forte. So if I can do this, you can too. But again, it's a matter of figuring out a method that works best for you. That's really the most important thing at the end of the day. So this is a garden I designed in South Kansas City. I wanted to show you all, this is a lot of biodiversity, but the person I was working with seemed keen on having a variety of species that bloom throughout the year. So I started with the pin oak in the center, and I wish I should have had a photo of the sketch. I guess I have a little bit later something similar, but I just drew like a circle in the middle of my paper, measured out from that pin oak to the wafer ash that's there. That was 25 feet. I marked that. I measured the pin oak to a deciduous holly, which was also there. I even had figured out the distance from the pin oak to the house. So whatever solid structural reference points you can use, the more accurate your design will be. So I created this design in Adobe Illustrator. And again, the only reason why I used that software is because I'm an art student, a former art student, and I just know my way around Adobe suites. But you can also use things like PowerPoint. You can use Excel spreadsheet. I know my friend May said that she uses Excel. There's so many different things you can do. Again, it's whatever resources you have and tools at your hand. And of course, you could do this by hand. I did in my pocket and I had spent probably 12 hours on it. So I've gone digital now, just to save me some heartache of, that situation. So in this design, I want to talk about scale. Again, that's the scary part, right? It was really intimidating for me when I first got started. So whether you have graph paper or you're using a version online, like in my case, Adobe Illustrator, you lay your graph out and you figure out, depending on the scale of your garden, how to shrink down the ratio. So for me, I'm working with, in these scenarios, pretty small gardens. So each large square represents 2 square feet, and the tiny squares in the middle represent 3 inches. Now you could do the same thing, like if you're working on like 100-foot by 800-foot area, you could do like a 1 to 10 ratio. So every inch equals 10 feet. Garden, and that will help you figure out how to do your scale, if that makes sense. And I'll continue talking about how I figured out the size of the plants, right? So this is my friend Ellen's garden that I designed and installed. And here, again, you see I've got clusters of 3, 5, 7. That not only creates kind of a bigger impact visually, but is more helpful for pollinators and wildlife who can see a larger swath of their food source and come in. So it's a win-win aesthetically and for wildlife benefit. So the way I determine the size of each plant represented on my graph here was actually determined by the growers. So when you buy your plants at our native plant sales at the Discovery Center or our local native plant nurseries, you will see a tag and it'll have size, like overall size of the plant, and sometimes it has spacing guidelines. So I really, I refer to the overall size of the plant, and I try to represent that in my design, because when you get little plants, they're so tiny, like little babies, but they do grow up, right? Just like you and me. So you want to make sure you are giving them enough space and knowing which plants prefer to be where. I did this design last year and installed it in the summertime, and I will show you and talk a little bit more about the successes and challenges. And this garden is in Kansas City off like 75th and just past Warnell. Native plant gardens are everywhere. So I want to talk a little bit about how we did this site from start to finish, just because, again, it's one thing to design a garden or plant a garden, it's another to grow a garden. So this method you're seeing here is called solarization. It's where we take plastic and we've pinned it in place to kill the turf grass. And you can, I don't know if you'll be able to see this, but there's a tiny bit of rope laying here that I used to create the curve of this garden bed. I didn't measure that. I just visually did what looked right. And you can see here these measurements. Like this was really an easy bed to design because 3 out of 4 of the sides are 90-degree angles. So I was able to get the measurements of all of those, figure out kind of the distance from the sidewalk to the steps up to their front door. And then again, that curve, I was able to get those measured points. Once I laid out my rope, I did that first, and then I went and took note of where this point is in relation to the back side of the sidewalk, and this part of the sidewalk. Sorry, 2 sidewalks. Same with this reference point up here. And you can also use, you could put in like a stake and have reference points here and here every like 6 feet or so, if depending on how accurate you want it. Now, again, if this is just for you, you can kind of fudge it a little bit because, again, these designs are more as a guideline and a roadmap for you to be on your way. So we solarized this in order to kill the existing turf grass. You can see we left some things like her irises and coreopsis. And that was done in the summertime, heat of summer. And you can see it's not fully successful, but we did a pretty good job killing back some of this. And you can tell the grass already wasn't happy there. So instead of tilling or digging up or cutting the sod out, we like to do a less labor intensive method, which is just that solarization, followed by after this point, we laid down cardboard for lasagna composting, which I will include resources following this presentation. And it's essentially you just break down a bunch of cardboard boxes, layer them up, and the cardboard eventually decomposes into compost. So in this situation, we did the solarizing, we did the cardboard, and then we brought in a few cubic yards of compost to put on top, just to give these plants a jump start. And this is what it looked like as we were installing. I just noticed Alex in the background there. So another recommendation is when you go to install, you'll have your design with you, but I think it's really important to lay out all your plants first and then start planting them in. That way you can really make sure you've got all the plants spread out as evenly as you want. And I want to just mention here that tool on the left is a hori knife. It is a great tool for cutting into that cardboard layer, because when you're at this stage, you don't want to, the goal with the cardboard is to suppress weeds, right? I don't know if I mentioned that, but it's to suppress weeds because all that brand new compost is just begging for some plants to start growing in there, right? So you use that hori knife to just kind of cut an X in through the compost and through the cardboard, and then you kind of open it up and you can put your plug in there and then water it in. And this is what these gardens looked like right after planting. I was really concerned about the slope of the garden on the left in regards to the having cardboard and like a slick surface and then compost on it, but it didn't seem to run off. So we got pretty lucky there. But so that's what it looked like after the initial planting. And then I just wanted to include, we did a little shade garden underneath their dogwood too by the house. So I didn't have a chance to visit this garden until this is probably fall of last year. And you can see how prolific everything is, right? Look at this. From that on the left to this. So a couple recommendations I have is I'm recommending to the homeowner to, cut back that rose verbena that's on the sidewalk, but holler at that rose verbena because look how thick it is. It is beautiful. Very happy there. I can also tell the Cliff goldenrod is looking great and happy, as well as the aromatic aster. But there are some little volunteer trees popping up in there. So it's important to be sure to pull those out. And then the recommendation of cutting the rose verbena back pretty soon, maybe here in the next few weeks, just to get everything going. First year, I planted in the fall, and I guess this is the year after that. So this is the first growing season. Now there's some areas that didn't do well. Oh, and you can kind of see some of the trees here that need to be taken out. But oh, actually, it wasn't that things didn't. So I can't wait to come back and check out this garden in the springtime and kind of see what other plants are doing well, and which plants could use a little more support. Also, I just want to mention the value of having intentional borders in your garden. Native plants always, not always, but they have historically gotten a bad rap. But any garden can be beautiful. And I think it's a matter of shifting our social perspectives on what we find beautiful. So in the meantime, I encourage you all to install some kind of border. I typically end up mulching my gardens the first, just one after I initially plant them. And then I don't do it again after that first initial mulching. And that's again just to help with weed suppression. Because gardens take work, right? It takes a lot of work to maintain. So anything I can do to set myself up for success initially can be helpful. Oh, and yeah, borders are also just really important, and signage, right? Signage is important to let your neighbors know what's going on, right? Since it is kind of becoming a more normalized thing, having native gardens in your front yard and replacing your lawn. But that just helps further the efforts. Okay, so I have a few more site studies I want to go over. Um, this is Primrose Prairie. You're thinking, what? That's not Primrose Prairie. I've seen Primrose Prairie. This I'm gonna show you all from start to finish how I designed this garden here at the Discovery Center. It's my first public garden that I had the opportunity to design when I pretty much first started, which was very scary, but very exciting. So if you've been to the Discovery Center in our Prairie area, you know that there's a nice tall section, which we like to have a variety of garden types here at the center. But this section is mostly white crown beard. It's got a little bit of cut plant, which I love, but a lot of tall ragweed. So we went ahead and they said, okay, Sid, you're going to take this little strip here and turn it into something cool. So I said, all right. So my sketch on the right, see, I tell you, I'm technically an artist, but that sketch on the right is maybe not the most beautiful thing I've made, but it is so helpful to get started, right? So I used like I used the sidewalk, I used this rock that was there, and I used the trees to measure out the footprint of this garden bed. Now it was slightly easier because there's a mulch path on the south side of the proposed bed. But yeah, so any way you can get from A to Z with your native gardening designs, that's all that matters. It doesn't matter how beautiful or ugly they are, if it's for you, you know. I also made note of the directions, right? Where's north? And what are my structural elements? So these two hackberries here, though they're on the north side of the garden, they do overhang just enough to cast some shade. I also, knowing what was growing in that bed before, was able to determine that, or at least I had an idea that from the hackberry. And then here on the left, you saw that image before, just concept sketches. I want to mention though that colorful little blobby thing there in the middle. That is just me filling out with color to get a sense of what the blooms will look like at any given moment. So again, that's just a way for me to wrap my head around all this. And here's the crazy design I came up with. So I would not recommend you have this many species in your garden if you are just getting started. I mean, you can totally go for it. I'm sure I've got friends out there like May saying, no, more is better. But I really do think it's a lot easier to start with fewer species and then expand from there. But did I listen to my own advice? No. So I went ahead and um, created this plan called Primrose Prairie. I actually don't even have all the species listed on here because I ended up, after we did the initial install, started adding other little plants here and there, which is also the beauty, right? Gardens, again, they're dynamic. So they're not going to stay static. They're always going to change, which means you always have opportunities to add more plants or get to know new species, which I think is really cool. So I want you all to guess how many plants are in this design. Um, feel free to put it in the chat if you'd like, but there are so many plants here. And I'm just curious if you have any guesses. Okay, someone said, oh, that's funny. I don't know how someone signed in as me. That's weird. Cydney Ross says 250 species. We have over Actually, we have 500 species in this garden. Um, not species, I'm sorry, plants. We have 500 plants in this garden and over 20 species. And this is a garden that, again, I designed it. And then my coworker, Alex, and we installed it together. So this is what to scrape the soil, but you don't necessarily have to do this anyway. But for our situation here, scraping this section was necessary because the seed bank is just overloaded with both ragweed and crownbeard and passion vine and all kinds of wonderful plants, but plants that we don't want to have to the plants that we don't want to outcompete the new plants that we were going to install. So we had the opportunity to scrape the surface, bring in some new compost. But if you don't have those means, which would make a lot of sense, consider doing that solarization and lasagna compost method. That is it'll get you to a similar result in terms of suppressing weeds and just getting the plants set up. And after we added the compost and went rock shopping, which was probably the coolest thing I've ever done, we also installed this nice sandstone rock border here to kind of, again, show that intentionality within this garden, to delineate that this is indeed a garden and not a place for people to walk in, right? And also, as a garden is in progress, you could always have a sign that indicates that. I know we had like a construction sign up or something, or bamboo hoops, or just something to kind of show like we're intentionally doing something here. So I had the opportunity to source our native plants from several local native nurseries, including City Roots Nursery, So Wild Natives, and Missouri Wildflower Nursery. Those three, there's a handful of native plant nurseries here in Kansas City. Missouri Wildflower Nurseries out in Jeff City, or Brazito, actually, Missouri. But we're just so fortunate here to have access to lots of native plants. So this was the first round that I received. So, 500 plants is a lot to keep in our tiny greenhouse, and it's a lot to keep alive, right? So it's important once you get them in the ground, which is also another reason I would suggest you plant your garden in stages, because I don't know, I was lucky enough to have a coworker to help me plant all of this in a matter of a week and a half, I think. And here's what the garden looks like now. So this is my baby, my pride and joy Primrose Prairie. And this was the year after it was planted. So going into 24, we will be entering, let's see, our third full growing season. So this picture was taken by Pat Whalen, one of our naturalists here at the center. He's also an artist himself, a great photographer, and he snapped some great pictures of this garden for me. So I hope you'll come back in to the center at the end of May or beginning of June to see how the garden looks this year. And again, the species I selected, they are prairie, because you can see it does get hit with a little bit of shade from those trees, which I was really concerned about when we first installed it. But I was really convinced that these plants would work based on the species that were already growing in that area. So it's been kind of an interesting back and forth. And most of the species have worked really well. The only one, there's a couple that have not though. Rose verbena does struggle in this garden. I think it's just, I don't know what it is. It might be too wet. It might oh, the other one was rigid goldenrod. And I think it just gets a little too much shade in this bed because I'm noticing some powdery mildew. So we'll see. So again, keep that in mind. You may plant your garden and see after the first year that there are things you love and there are things you don't like. And that's the beauty of gardening. You know, we are it's like art. It's like making art. You make decisions, you take a step back, you look at it, and then maybe you make some more decisions later. So the next site I want to show you is one that I helped design near the Nelson Atkins Museum here in Kansas City. This is the East Gallery HOA. Shout out to that crew if they're here. This is a 800 foot by 150 foot section that was covered in winter creeper, one of those invasive species. This neighborhood association did an incredible job coming together and organizing, and they removed all of this by hand. So they started by pulling, they started cutting and treating, but they knew that they could not start their garden that they wanted until they got it under control. So I did the design for them, and then Missouri. Oh, actually, I'm jumping ahead of myself. You saw the winter creeper. You see in this photo on the right how they removed it. They marked where their irrigation is because it has sprinklers, and then they brought compost in because a lot of that soil there was just really heavily compacted clay soil. And again, they're trying to kind of get a nice foundation set up by having that compost layer. Because as many of you know, native plants you should not fertilize them unless you're keeping them alive in a greenhouse. Like they do not need fertilizer. They get the nutrition they need from the soil. But if your soil's crappy, you may do like a top dressing of compost. Okay, so I designed the garden, and then City Roots Nursery here in Kansas City. Shout out to Zach and Kristen. They did the installation. And I don't remember how many plants were in this design, but it was a lot more than Primrose Prairie. And they just did an incredible job with the installation. And this is what it looked like. Let's see, they prepped it over the summer. That was, I guess, 2 years ago. Wow, time flies. 2 years ago, and then installed it that fall. And then this photo must be from just this past spring. So you can see the light purple woodland Phlox divaricata, and golden groundsel, the yellow happy friends in the back. That is Pacra obovata. Those have done really well. There's also some columbine I kind of see the back of that photo, but so some of the challenges that they have with this garden are unfortunately rabbit pressure. So I didn't quite know how much rabbits loved Wild Sweet William until after this design. And I mean, it's hard. I can't be mad at them because they don't have much food going on for them otherwise. So you lay out this 800-foot strip buffet, like, of course I get it. So we'll see how it does this year. It does bounce back though, because as you know, plants have evolved with wildlife. Again, for thousands of years since the Ice Age. So they kind of got this thing going on, right? So as long as you have enough plants or they're well established enough, Even if you get some herbivory, in the long run, it shouldn't hurt it. But of course, if you've just planted your plants and you got rabbits and deer eating them, you'll want to figure out how to protect them, whether with a cage or with, in this case, maybe some scram. There's some options there. But alternatively, if that, in this case, like if the phlox doesn't work out, then we will just, we'll find another plant to put in there instead. Okay, and then I wanted to show you all this garden. For those of you who have established gardens, but you're just wanting to add a little more native plants to it, this is for you. So this is my friend Susan's garden. This is my favorite native garden in Kansas City. She has been working on this garden, I want to say for 20 years or so, and you can tell. So I had the privilege of helping her in her garden a few years ago, and we wanted to add some more sedges here beneath the dogwood, because as you can see, by having that bare soil, which bare soil is, it can be really good, especially for seeds to come in and plant themselves. So we did a combination, or I at this point I'd recommend seeding over it, but we took the tiniest little plugs we could get, and then I just very gingerly removed the soil, like dug a little hole and planted those in there. So that way we weren't damaging or disturbing the tree roots, but also helping to kind of protect them, because you can see how badly that water or the soil is just kind of eroding from that section. So you can do this if you have an established garden, look for those openings, especially if you have lots of spring bloomers. What's coming up in the summertime? Do you have anything for pollinators or for birds? You can go ahead and get plugs and kind of fill in those gaps as you would in this situation. And then I just want to include this beautiful picture of these flowers. Again, that Phlox auricata, the crested iris on the right, and the robin plantain on the left, those little daisy flowers. And that's a stone walkway. So again, if you have like stone steps outside and you're constantly pulling weeds out, why don't you put a plant there that you want instead? You know, robin's plantain, pussy toes, any Antenaria species, those do great in these dry little crevices. And just some general tips for native landscape design. I cannot stress enough getting to know your space and knowing your goals and doing your own research. Also, start small and simple. You can always expand your designs. Don't drive yourself crazy like I do sometimes and just get overwhelmed by all the opportunities and options for your garden. And don't forget curves, swaths, and groupings of plants. I kind of touched on curves a little bit in regards to like how to lay it out with a rope or a hose, but curves are natural, right? They're more natural for our eyes aesthetically. And if we try to design with really straight lines, like 90-degree angles, if any of that is off just by a little bit, it looks way off. So really encourage those swaths and kind of curves around the edges of your garden, but also with your groupings of plants. You know, if you want to do clusters of a few plants here, maybe later you end up expanding that or letting them go to seed so they increase into a swath. But again, those larger, like more intentional groupings not only look better, but are easier for wildlife to find the food sources because it's like a big billboard. And just don't forget, gardens are dynamic, just like you and me. And you got to embrace change in your garden each season and over the years. That's really the best way to get to know your garden and work with nature. And then I'm going to leave this screen up here while I jump into the Q&A. So appreciate you all. Lots of exciting conversations here in both the chat and the Q&A. So please put them in the Q&A. So that's where I'm going to start by answering questions. All right. So Claudia has a question about growing underneath large oak trees and dealing with hard clay soil. So gosh, that is so challenging because very few things want to thrive in those conditions. Dry shade is like a really tough one. even if you're having a hard time getting started, as long as you are picking plants that can handle that shade, then you can approach that there. Um, If nothing is growing under there, maybe consider doing a light dressing of compost. Now, you do not want to put too much soil or mulch or anything right at the base of your tree because you can suffocate the roots, right? Roots sometimes can be intentionally shallow in order to get oxygen, but you could try a light dressing of compost, just, in the consideration of amending the soil, and then broadcast some seeds into there. Like if you can't get any plugs to grow, consider seeding that area with some of those species. Okay. I still don't know how people were able to sign up for Zoom using my name. I know that must have been an error on my end, but Cydney Ross asks, I have a steep slope that is grassed and dangerous for mowing, but we do it. I know we need to start small, so mowing will still be needed as we expand to fill the area. About 40 feet long, 25 feet deep. How large an area should we tackle first? Suggested plant material, and this slope faces west and is part sun. Okay, yeah. So this is a great question. People are all over are trying to shrink their lawns because who wants to spend time mowing your grass? Like I'd rather play with flowers personally. So with a steep slope, I would consider 40 feet long, 25 feet deep. So you might start at the top and just kind of work your way down. Considering seeds, as they fall, they might start planting in that area. I can't suggest how large an area should you tackle first, but if you want to break it up into like 2 or 3 sections, that could be and depending on like your interest and ability to get in the landscape, that's how I would approach how you go about breaking up that area. And for suggested plant material, if it's just turf grass, you could try the solarizing method. And instead of doing the cardboard, if that grass is dead, you could actually cut right into it and start planting into that as a like planting medium. That'd be kind of cool. But just remember everyone, like when you plant, you want to keep your things watered well for the first 2 weeks so that their roots get established. I probably won't go over too many species recommendations today, just because I want to keep it to elements of design and how to approach that. But that Sweet 16 list has full sun options. So for a slope, I would consider something that definitely something that creeps. You might consider having like a matrix of like little blue stem grass and some purple poppy mallow that grows up through it. Here I am saying I'm not going to suggest species, but it's hard not to. But the idea of you want some spreaders, right, in that location, and encourage those seeds to go further into the landscape. Okay, so Lake asked, when you observe your space, do you need to check every season or just spring and summer? Is it good to check at different times during the day? Yes, yes, and yes. I like to have as much information about my area as I can. And so what I like to do is go out in the morning, mid-afternoon, late afternoon, and early evening to snap pictures. But you might be like, wow, do I have to take pictures of my whole, like my whole yard, landscape, etc.? I would focus on the areas that you want to add your garden first. Otherwise I mean, that's good information. Depends on how in depth you want to get into it, but that's how I would kind of approach it. And I would do it every season. You can get a lot of good insight in the springtime about where water will settle in your yard. If we get some good spring rains this year, and as well as which areas dry out in the summertime. So I think you learn a lot of information in any given season. So I do encourage you to spend a whole year kind of getting to know your space. Oh, hey, mom. My mom is here. What's up, Pam? What is a good substitute for honeysuckle once it's removed? So this question's coming up because I went and removed some honeysuckle in my mom's backyard. And it can be shocking, right? When you first remove plants, especially ones that you've been used to seeing. I wasn't able to remove all of them, but I did manage to remove the front line of them so that they stopped dropping berries in her yard and inhibiting the growth of the native plants I put in there. So good substitutes for honeysuckle would include like spice bush, um, hazelnut, witch hazel, like any kind of smaller shrub. Um, in your case, Mom, I would say maybe even like fragrant sumac could be good. So, hint taken, I will put some more shrubs in your backyard this year. Okay. Jeanette asks, okay, cool. So they have very rocky soil and they want to know some good ways to work with this soil. What are good plants? That's a great question. So rocky, um, well-draining areas are aligned with our glade species. So think of dry, rocky outcroppings. But like Wildcat Glade and Joplin could be a good place to look at. But also when you go to your native plant nurseries, they're experts too. They grow their plants, and they have really special relationships with them and know what they need. So I recommend when you go to your native plant nursery, you tell them what kind of soil you're working with, what kind of sunlight you've got going on, and they can make some direct recommendations. But if this rocky soil is full sun, then I would recommend Missouri Evening Primrose. That is the plant that I have at Primrose Prairie. It just does great. It's like it loves hot, dry soil. Same with purple poppy mallow. Um, Someone asked how long does honeysuckle chemical stay in the soil after they are removed? So in reference to the allelopathic chemical that honeysuckle um excretes through their berries, I don't know actually how long, but in my experience, when I've removed honeysuckle, like say in the fall or winter, I plant in the following spring. So like the area that I referenced behind my mom's house, I will be planting that this spring, and I just cut them down like a week ago. So I feel pretty confident that you can do it soon after, which you do want to do it sooner than later because again, you have that open space. It's an invitation for more plants to come in. Okay, Lake has some other good questions. Thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate all your questions. And if I don't get to all of them, um, which we've got 20 minutes left, I will email everyone anything I don't get to with the resources next week. So Lake is asking about resources that we use for native plants. So yeah, Deep Roots is a great resource. If you go to our website and click Plant a Garden, it will take you from the very beginning all the way to the end of like doing maintenance and things like that. So I will link that to you all in your email. In reference to that spreadsheet, I recommend you all make your own. Like the information I have on there is all already like online. It's in like the Missouri Wildflower Nursery catalog. Or you can just use your own observations to fill out that data, which frankly would be really cool, I think, just because it could kind of show different microclimate. But of course, you're like, well, how can I do that if I don't have plants in the ground yet? So maybe that's a more advanced technique. But like, I will be sure to email everybody all these resources next week so that you can continue your research. And people are Lake also asked about ground covers that are durable for pets and children. So there is, I mean, within reason, like no one likes to get trampled. Like it doesn't matter what you plant, unless it's turf grass. Like that is a good reason for a good argument for turf grass is to have an area where kids and dogs and whoever can play, right? Um, I'm thinking maybe some sedges could work well in that instance, but I'm having a hard time remembering the type. If anybody was at the Planet Native conference in the sedge presentation, let me know because you may remember, but I think it was Texas sedge, but I could be wrong on that. But regardless, no matter what you put there, they can handle moderate things, can handle some foot traffic, but not very much. Violets are a great ground cover too, though. So if you have that in your yard, I think at least that's better than just straight up turf grass, and it can handle being trampled a little bit. Okay, Peggy Strickland would like to replace hostas around a mature tree with something that's more pollinator friendly. So I would recommend shady species. In fact, that shady soft landings would be the perfect option for you on our Sweet 16 list. So that would include things like Dittany and what else was it? Let me grab, I think I have, oh no, I don't have the flyer there. I think, yeah, it was Dittany, Columbine, and a couple others. But those would be great because, again, typically around a mature tree, it's going to be drier, it's going to be shadier. But those options, and that shady soft landing on the Sweet 16 would be good options for that. Another great question from Lake. Also, I love your name. By the way, that's really wonderful. Do you plant all the plants at the same time, even though they are blooming at different times? That's actually a really interesting question, and I'd be curious to hear other people's input in the chat. But a couple years ago, I thought about planting like um spring bloomers in the fall and fall bloomers in the spring. Now, of course, if you can plant all of them at once, that's great. But if you can't, or if you're wanting to get your plant established in hopes that it has blooms within the first year, you may consider that method. Um, that way the plants have a chance to get their roots established, right? Because you've all heard the phrase, first year they sleep, second year they creep, third year they leap. And when you first get a plant in the ground, it's really taking that time to get the roots established. But again, if you are hoping to get a little more bang for your buck and kind of encourage more blooms earlier, when you get them planted in, that could be a way. I'm not saying it's foolproof, but I have done that before. Okay, and in regards to figuring out like the size of the plants, do I have a favorite site to use? I usually stick with my um I usually stick with the vendors I'm buying the plants from for that information. But you could also use Missouri Botanical Garden. They have really good insight. So does Grow Native. Grow Native has a wonderful resource about their plants and like when they bloom, who they support, how big do they get. So I'll be sure to include that in the link as well. Oh, Cydney. There's so many Cydneys in here. That's so weird. How many dollars do you need to cover a few hundred square feet? How is any garden from scratch affordable? That's a legit question. And keep in mind, like Primrose Prairie, for example, I could not afford to do that on my own. That was because of Missouri Department of Conservation. And homeowners, same deal. If you're hiring someone to design and install and buy plants, it can get expensive quickly. So here's my recommendations to start a native plant garden from scratch in an affordable way. Consider buying seeds and growing them in winter sowing, at like the winter sowing method. So that would mean, maybe doing your research this year, figuring out what plants you want, and then purchase seeds from local vendors and start growing them indoors over the winter time or in like a recycled container with soil and whatnot. We have a winter sowing episode we did couple months ago. I'll send as well. But that is a really affordable way to start growing or to have plants. And because it can get really expensive, because I know plants are like one plant is very affordable, but if you are trying to design like a really well aesthetically designed garden, then yeah, you will probably need a lot more plants than you anticipate. But here's the thing too, that's also another good reason for you to start small. Start in stages, start where you can. And there's no reason you can't have native plants. And if you can't find plants or you can't afford them, come to the Discovery Center. We have our Go Native event in April. April 27th. Go Native from 10 to 2. It's a walk-in event, similar to like our Urban Woods event if you were here a couple weeks ago. But it's we're currently growing native plants in our greenhouse, and we give them away for free to the public every year. Now, they have humble beginnings. They're grown this year, so they're not even a whole year old, so they're very small. But that can also be a good way. Or go to your local plant swaps. I know Facebook, there's a great native plant Kansas City Native Plant Swap Facebook group online. So don't distress. There are so many ways that you can do it. But again, if you're covering a few hundred square feet, I would consider starting small and going from there. What are those cute border fences on Primrose Prairie? Those are bamboo hoops from Gardener's Edge. Those are awesome. I love using hoops to delineate a garden from the lawn or to discourage foot traffic. We're lucky here at the center. We don't have deer browse as much as we have rabbits and children. So those hoops work really well for that. So Gardener's Edge. And I will include that in the resources as well. All right. What were the species in the Nelson Atkins space? I'm gonna have to look into it. I couldn't locate my design quick enough for this presentation, but I'll try to include that in the resources as well. But there was a lot of wild ginger, columbine, lots of oak sedge. Oak sedge is like such a good plant, especially for just filling in those spaces. There was aromatic aster on the sunnier side, and I can't remember what else, but I'll be sure to include that in the resources. How sloped is that Nelson Atkins space? Well, you can go look if you're here in Kansas City. I couldn't tell you like a degree, but it was a pretty like, I don't know, I would say it's a slope, but it's gradual. Where do you get teeny plugs? What's the cost? So plugs can go anywhere from like $3.50 to $7 a plug. Just depends on where you get them from and how big they are. Now for teeny tiny plugs, I do recommend you consider Crit Site, Prairie and Wetland Center. They are off 350 Highway. They're an awesome resource for lots of native plants that are really tiny. And that's also a more affordable way to buy more plugs. You may also consider Taylor Creek Nursery in Kansas. And again, I will in the resources I email out to y'all, I will include like our local native plant nurseries. Cydney is asking, how do we amend the soil so you can plant natives in its spot where a tree had to be removed? I don't know if I would as much. Like if the tree's gone, I guess I would wonder, is there a stump left? And if there's not a stump left, I would just, if there's a weird dip, maybe add a little compost on top and just plant right into it. But the mycorrhizae, the fungus will be breaking down that root structure from that tree that was taken out. So I would consider that. But the only amending I would recommend you ever do if you're going to do any is just use some compost. Don't use anything else. Like nothing more, like don't fertilize and stuff like that. Okay, so I've got time to answer probably a handful more questions. How do we amend the soil? Oh wait, sorry, I just read that one. How do you handle very steep slope? Front and backyard where taller plants in the front might block the front of the house. I would plant really short. I would put really short species there. And then, you would kind of do, well, yeah, I guess. So if you have a slope like this and your house is here, short, just put really short plants. You could, well, I don't know if I'd recommend well, you could do some hardscaping in there too. I haven't done that myself so much, except for like the little border you saw at Primrose Prairie, but you could incorporate like dig in some and place some rocks in there to help you with like actually walking safely into that space. and then also adds like a little bit of visual interest that's not just plants. Okay. So yeah, Jenna, I just recommend shorter plant species, like your anything lower than 30 inches. Okay, so Kay's asking about a sunny, moist area near a sidewalk due to runoff. They installed French drains but need help with what to plant. So Kay, my question would be, is it always wet or does it get really wet and then really dry? So because it sounds like a micro rain garden to me. And with rain gardens, I initially when I learned about them, I thought of like semi-aquatic species, but that is really not the case. Like a rain garden, it gets air moments of a lot of moisture and then it can really dry out. So I would look for plants that can handle those kinds of conditions. We actually have an episode of Native Plants at Noon where we talk about plants that do well in like a health strip. So if that's more of your situation, you might look at that Native Plants at Noon episode. Um, but I would suggest shorter species. You know, if it's wet all the time, you could consider some there's some more moist tolerant sedges that can handle those areas, but I would have to have a little more information about it to be able to recommend species. Cydney asking about native ferns. Native ferns, oh man. So sorry, this is so shaky. I visited Native Plant or Missouri Wildflower Nursery with my landscape team this week, and we got to see their efforts in cultivating native ferns. I don't know anything about ferns other than they do not like to grow here at the Discovery Center. I I don't know of any native ferns that work well in clay soil, to be honest. Do you out there in the audience? Please let us know in the chat if you do. But um, yeah, I think, the ferns I see in our natural areas would be cut leaf grape fern. Um, and that one, it grows in our woodlands and it is not clay. So I think forcing a fern in a clay situation is probably not going to work out in the long run. Okay. So Jesse Bricker says that they love the idea of planting in stages, but is it better to do all 3 layers in a smaller area or plan the whole area, but start with just 1 or 2 layers? After structural, what's the most important layer to start with? I love this question. No one's asked me this question before. Um, so what I recommend is you start with doing your entire design, right? Create your whole design for the area. And then when you're ready to plant, I do recommend you start with your structural plants first. And you could break it down in either smaller areas or in like the layers like ground cover versus seasonal versus structural. Um, and either would be fine, but if I think it'd be kind of cool. I think regardless, not that it's cool, but regardless, you should start with your structural just because it will inform the type of sunlight situation for the other plants. And then after that, I would probably either do like either whether you're splitting up by area, like physical area, do it that way, or start planting your seasonal plants. But I would always save your ground cover species for last, because typically the ground cover species, like they're prolific, but they play well with others. So the idea is that they're going to spread in and kind of close those gaps between your other plants. That's an awesome question. Okay. Um, I'm gonna I'm gonna try to focus on more design-based questions. Okay, Christopher asks, they say, we want to get rid of the grass in our house strip between sidewalk and street, probably about 200 feet on a corner lot, 3 feet deep. What are some good ideas for designing this in a way that's low maintenance, but provides evergreen and blooms throughout the season? Assuming ground cover species. You're assuming correct. So again, I'm thinking back to the health strip episode that we did for our difficult gardening situations. And it was little blue stem is just a solid choice because not only does it thrive like pretty much anywhere dry, but it can handle a lot of salt. Um, and I'd also recommend purple poppy mallow. I know I think that's the third time I've mentioned that plant today. It's just really great for those really dry, hot conditions, and they spread out nicely. If it's, let's see, I think you said you didn't mention that it's dry, but you could, for the evergreen quality, I would consider golden groundsel, which is Pacra obovata. That's the a very common ground cover species that's available. It spreads nicely. You can dig it up and divide it later too. And also penstemon, Penstemon digitalis, also known as foxglove beard tongue, the little white flowers. They not only are they cute like the flowers are, but the foliage, after you cut the plant back, in the or if you whether you cut it back or not. But in the wintertime, the basil foliage is like this nice green, maroon color, and it sticks around all year. So those are some that I would recommend for that area. Oh, lake, there are native honeysuckle plants. So our native honeysuckle is coral honeysuckle and yellow honeysuckle. At least those are two that I'm aware of that are cultivated, and they're a vining variety. We have tons of the coral at the Discovery Center in the middle of our prairie. It's a very fun plant. Loves full sun. Okay, Tonya, I love a new gardener because we all started there, right? So Tonya says that they don't really even know where to begin, but any advice on managing expectations of a native garden? Yes. So I can't stress enough to really be firm in what your gardening goals are. If you want to support, like if you want to have pollinator plants, if you want to have food for songbirds, um, those will inform the plants you pick. So get clear on what your goals are first and foremost. And then in terms of expectations, gardens require work. There's no such thing as an NO maintenance garden. It's all about knowing your maintenance and knowing your plants. So just keep in mind, yeah, gardens will need to be weeded. They might need some water if we go through another drought, which we probably will. So just know that they're alive just like you and me, and they do need tender, loving care sometimes. So okay. Buffalo grass question. Okay, so buffalo grass is really cool. We've had not good success here, and that's frankly user error on our part. So at the Discovery Center, I'm actually looking at it. You can kind of see part of it out the window here. Behind our classrooms, the turf was planted with buffalo grass, and it works really well in full sun, dry situations. I mean, full sun, like any lick of shade on it, it really doesn't like it. The example out here is we have some trees that the shade will land on the buffalo grass, and we have like an outline of a tree where it's died. So I think it's kind of funny just from the shadow of the tree. So yeah, if you're gonna use buffalo grass, I don't know about for traffic areas, but I walk on it all the time and it seems fine. But it needs to be full sun. It's common out in like western Kansas. So imagine it's being dried out from lots of wind and getting beaten on with the sun. Janet, I will include some rock links in the resources next week. And then my last question from Cydney. I don't know what happened. I'm sorry about that, y'all. Any advice for planting a dry roadside strip with buried utilities and overhead lines? Yes, always call before you dig. Please do not hurt yourself gardening. That would be my first tip. Make sure you call the appropriate resources to get areas marked. And for in regards to the overhead lines, make sure you're not planting any trees that will get tall enough to compete directly with the line. So I think I'll look for the resource online. about how far exactly to plant away from overhead lines, but I can't remember how many feet off the top of my head, so I'm not going to say that, but I would just recommend you be considerate not to plant like a tulip poplar that's going to grow 40 feet tall right beneath that overhead line. Consider doing shrubs, consider doing well, maybe not shrubs even, because if they need to access the overhead lines, I consider herbaceous perennial flowers. So flowers and also grasses that can be cut down as needed for maintenance. But you know, I think anything you do in there in that way would be good. Okay. So I got so many wonderful comments here in the chat. So many great questions. And I just want to say I thank you to all of you for joining me today. The fact that you're here and wanting to add native plants to your landscape brings me so much joy. And I hope you won't be a stranger. Come visit us at the Discovery Center. Join me for my virtual programs later this month. And yeah, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out, and I will email you all sometime next week with a list of resources. I took a lot of notes of what to send to you all. So thank you and have a wonderful rest of your day.